Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're just admitting folks to the webinar, and we'll be getting underway in just a moment. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're so pleased you could all join us here virtually, both here in Zoom and live on YouTube, for the virtual Winnipeg launch of Still Hopeful, Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism by Maude Barlow. To begin, I'd like to thank some of the people that have come on board to help present and promote this event. Those include the Manitoba Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, our colleagues at McNally Robinson Saskatoon, and of course, the people who published this book, ECW Press. Now, one thing I will point out before we begin, imperfect automatically generated captions are available for this event. You can access those just by pressing the CC Live Transcript button, which is just at the bottom of the screen. I'll put some information on that in the chat. Now, copies of this book are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can visit us in person. You can order the book online. You could also just give us a call. Not only do we deliver locally in Winnipeg, but we can also mail them nationally and internationally. And I'll put that information in the chat as well. Now, over the course of the evening, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions of Maude. Just to simplify everything, we ask that you please write those questions in the Q&A box, which you can also find just at the bottom of the screen. Rest assured, you will not interrupt us by asking questions, and then your host, Paul Moist, can put those to Maude as time permits. In addition, you'll notice there is a live chat going. So if you have positive comments or anything you might like to say to tonight's participants, all positive, of course, please feel free to write those just in the chat. Though they may not be monitoring that directly, as we're trying to ensure people's attention is not divided from the conversation itself, I will be certain to send those comments along to the participants at the close of the event. So feel free to be as loquacious as you would like. Now, I'll be back to introduce your host for the evening in just a moment. But first, I'd like to invite Hannah Muhajarine, who's a CCPA steering committee member and an organizer with the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, to offer a few words. Hannah?
Thanks so much, John, and I'm really happy to be here tonight, even if just virtually. On behalf of the CCPA, I'd like to say that we are very proud to be a co-sponsor for the launch of Still Hopeful by Maude Barlow. The CCPA is Canada's leading progressive research institute, producing research and commentary on a wide range of public policy issues. We are also a member of Climate Action Team Manitoba, a coalition which has developed an alternative climate pathway for the province called The Road to Resilience. It is a complete guide for getting off fossil fuels while making sure that that energy transition is also transformational, grounded in improving our lives and bringing us a little bit closer to the kind of just and equitable society we all deserve to live in. I've been involved in this work on the road to resilience, and while I'm very proud of that, I also get a little bit frustrated whenever I remember that it should be the Manitoba government doing this work instead. While they avoid accepting the responsibility to act, April blizzards lead to citywide shutdowns and now flooded basements. Many of my generation and those younger are wondering whether we will even have children, not just because of looming climate catastrophe, but also because of the increasing economic precarity we face. All of this is to say, it seems like these days there's no shortage of reasons to feel hopeless. But that's one of the reasons why I'm so looking forward to hearing from Maude Barlow tonight. Maude calls hope a moral imperative, and that really resonates with me. Hope is a practice, just as important to engage in as a fight itself, whatever kind of fight you find yourself in. Hope is essential for keeping going in the face of frustration and fear. I'm grateful for Maude for not letting us forget that. I'm so looking forward to what she has to share tonight, learning from her years of experience and taking inspiration and courage from her story. And I hope you all feel that way as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. As mentioned, one of the most delightful things about having Maude Barlow for events, both virtual and in person, is that feeling of optimism that one walks away from the events with. So I'm so very grateful to be able to be here to listen and to hear the conversation. And I note that our host for the evening, Paul Moist, has just joined us. So I would like to point out that Paul Moist is the former national president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. He served on a wide range of community boards throughout his 4 decades as a trade union member. And since 2016, he has served as a worker representative on the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. He's a labor spokesperson, labor history expert, and he's received numerous trade union and public service awards. He's a graduate of the University of Manitoba and a lifelong citizen of Winnipeg. Please join me in virtually welcoming the man immediately above me, Paul Moist.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Hannah, as well, and welcome everybody. We've had a tremendous response to this latest McNally launch of a Maude Barlow book. I'm going to introduce Maude very briefly in a moment. We're going to hear from Maude. Her and I will then discuss this latest work of hers, and then we'll move, as John said, to the Q&A portion of the evening. Maude will sign off with some final comments, and we'll turn it back to John, and that's how the evening is going to unfold. So we're going to keep this brief so we can get right to our special guest, but many of us know Maude Barlow as for over 30 years, the voluntary chairperson of the Council of Canadians. She's also a formidable author, and tonight we will learn about her 20th published book. She sits on the board of Food and Water Watch, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and is a counselor with the World Future Council. She served as a senior water advisor to the United Nations General Assembly and was a leader in the campaign to have water recognized as a human right. She is the recipient of 14 honorary doctorates, the Right to Livelihood Award, and is the current chancellor of Brescia University. She lives in Ottawa, where she joins us tonight. And let me give a warm Winnipeg welcome on behalf of your many friends and everybody online tonight and YouTube to our guest of honor, Maude Barlow. Hi, Maude.
Wow, thank you, Paul, so much. Thank you, John and McNally Robinson, for once again hosting me and being so kind. Thank you to Hannah and CCPA. And Hannah, thank you so much for your words about being young and having fears about the future. That is exactly why I wrote the book. And so thank you to you. And I'm going to come back to my friend Paul in a minute, but I just want to say that I'm greeting you from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm just delighted to be here. I'm really excited because I know I have so many friends in Winnipeg and Manitoba, so many wonderful activists, so many people who care so deeply, and I wish I could hold all your hands and we could go out together for a party after this, but we'll have to do it virtually. But you just give me hope, and frankly, in the end, that's what this work is about. It's about each other and what we're doing. I've been thinking about the issue of hope for quite a long time and hadn't planned to write a book until the COVID crisis came. And then I was grounded. I do a lot of traveling in my work, or did, and found I had time on my hands to really sit down and think about it. And I remember that Rebecca Solnit said that every big social upheaval opens the door for deep change. And I thought this is the moment to do this. And I just, what I've been feeling, and Paul and I are going to talk about this, is that I worry very much, and I'm worried about working with young people and with my grandkids, that the feeling of hopelessness that one can feel, and there's lots to feel hopeless about, can make you think that the situation's hopeless when it's actually not. But that paralyzes us when we should be not allowing it to be paralyzing. And of course, building a movement, which is all what it's all about. So I just want to say how grateful I am to Paul Moist. Paul has been a very dear friend for a long time. Paul was a great, great labor leader in our country, and we fought privatization of healthcare, privatization of water services. We fought several very bad free trade agreements. We crisscrossed the country together. One of the finest people that I know, and Paul did the honor of reading my book from the early manuscript and helping me, guiding me in some really important ways. And so I'm so thrilled to have this conversation that we're going to have now, and to give you a big virtual hug, Paul, and thank you.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Maude, and let's jump right into it. Still Hopeful. I've read all of Maude's books, and Still Hopeful is your most personal book, in my view. And early in the book, you speak, and I'll quote, "Hope being built into the DNA of my life," close quote. And you attribute this to your upbringing. And share with all of us tonight what your parents meant in terms of your lifelong activism.
Well, my mother and father were part of that generation of the Second World War that really had a different vision for what Canada was going to look like after the war. In my opinion, they were one of the great generations that built the Social Security, what Trudeau Senior called the Just Society, and so on. My mother was, her first husband was killed in the Second World War. She was pregnant with my older sister, but they didn't know that he just was missing in action. So she went back to live with her parents back in New Brunswick, and found out only 2 years later. So she had that hard time. My father, meanwhile, saw 5 very hard years in the war, was wounded just outside the Battle of Ortona in Italy. And came back absolutely determined, fell in love with my mother, and they decided to build a good life together. And my dad would say, we didn't come back to be put back in work camps. The same government that didn't have the money to feed, clothe, house, or employ people before the war suddenly had all the money they needed for all the war effort. Well, we weren't going to go back there. And I learned that with my morning oatmeal. My dad helped develop the whole concept of criminology, which is understanding justice for people in conflict with the law, whom he believed mostly came from poverty, violence, discrimination, and so on. My father was one of the leaders of the ending capital and corporal punishment. He wrote a book in 1955 called "Should Canada Abolish the Gallows and the Lash?" And I remember watching my dad, I was a little girl, on black and white TV, and their dad was debating the hangman. It was always named Mr. Ellis. It was a pseudonym, and he always had a hood on. And my dad was at the last double hanging at the Don Jail in 1962, I think it was. And not long after they brought in legislation. So we learned that you have the privilege of living in this country, and that you owed something back, and that you just don't take it for granted. So I don't know. I was always like wanting to be a good change maker, and I think I really did get that from my parents. So thank you for asking. That's my favorite. They're my favorite people, except for you, Paul.
Thank you, Maude. In preparation for tonight, I read a detailed interview you did with another publication about the book, and there you share what prompted you to put pen to paper. You speak about an evening panel discussion with David Suzuki and Avi Lewis, and an encounter you had with a young woman, and this led you towards Still Hopeful. Share this story with us. It's very poignant.
Well, I was at a big old church here in Ottawa in June 2019, and it was on the Green New Deal. And it was absolutely packed. When I tell you we turned away people, we turned away people. A lot of young people, which was quite wonderful. A lot of high school students, older, like grade 11 and 12, but still lots of young people. And there were a lot of reasons that people were down that night. The federal government had just okayed that they were going to buy a pipeline. And the Horgan government in BC had just agreed to, had announced they weren't going to stop the Site C Dam, and they were going to continue fracking and so on. So people were upset. And that kind of came across. And there was a lot of talk about the 6th grade extinction and, the ocean, the acidification of the ocean in the last 10 years and so on. And I could see people in the audience, particularly young people, including one of my granddaughters, Eleanor, who was then 16, just sitting there kind of in their seats, right? When I got up, I talked about hope. I talked about Blue Communities, a project Paul and I launched in 2009, to get municipalities to protect their water against privatization. And different things that we were doing. And really, you know, it was like, you can do things and you've got to find your place in this. And there are lots of solutions and lots of good things are happening. And don't let that feeling of hopelessness that I talked about a few minutes ago, don't let that make you feel it's all hopeless. So that turned into a real debate after. And I kind of got lectured a wee bit, but it was good. But at the end, these two young women came up, high school women, grade 12, I think. And one of them was just sobbing. And she said, this is the first of this type of thing I've ever gone to. And it would be the last if you hadn't talked about hope, because I was sitting there thinking, what can I do against these enormous issues? And I walked home that night, and I remember it was a full moon, and I talk in the book about the moon silvering the new green leaves, you know, and thought, I quoted a farmer friend of mine from PEI that were years ago, we fought the free trade agreements together. And he would say when he was feeling hopeless, he would ask himself, what's the next appropriate step to take? And he'd take it. And I thought, what's the next appropriate step to take? It's a book. And I need to speak to young people, although it's not written exclusively to young people, but I need to say why activism is a good life, a good thing to do. Get up every day caring about more than just yourself. It's a good life. And I need to say why that is, and not have people say it's too much. It's not too much if you take your piece of it, and have some faith that others are taking a piece of it too.
Wonderful. Thanks, Maude. I said at the outset, this is a deeply personal book, and there's an entire chapter devoted to, you call it The Rising of the Women. And it's your early years working in the women's movement in Canada, 1960s and into the 70s. And near the end of this fascinating chapter, in my view, you speak frankly about my white privilege. Please share with us what's behind this very frank admission on your part, almost a self-critique of the very good work the women's movement did, but there were people excluded from that work as well.
Well, I grew up in the by the way, as you know, I start that chapter with, oh, we are the women, our men warned us about, you know. So I start that chapter with a description of growing up in the 1950s in Ottawa, which was white. I mean, I'm telling you, it was the churches, the schools, the football teams, the baseball teams, the stores. That's what it was, or at least in the world that I was in, which was not rich. It was middle class, right? So, and you know, when you think about it, my mother needed my father's permission and signature to get a visa for travel, to open a bank account, to get a driver's license. I mean, it's so much has changed. Just a few years before my mother was born, the Canada Elections Act, it was actually the Dominion Elections Act, said no woman, idiot, criminal, or child shall vote. And, you know, so much has changed in that time, and it's been such a profound change. And so I was very much part of that, what's called second wave feminism. And it was very much about getting the laws changed, getting equality for women recognized in law, in academia, in pay equity, that kind of thing. And we just marched steadily forward. And it was a powerful time and a powerful movement. But looking back on it, and even starting to see it then, it was very clear that it was women, largely white, not exclusively, but almost, privileged in the sense of coming out of good schools, having families, parents, maybe a partner who was supportive, who made these changes. And I think that's pretty common that's what happened in the first wave of feminism, which is when women got the vote. It was women of privilege, women of some financial means who were able to do this. They didn't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and clean somebody's houses all day because they were able to do this. So, I mean, this is kind of a wave. But it became very clear as I look back on it, writing about it, that there were no people of color, no Black women, no Indigenous women on the major commissions, the Commission on the Status of Women, that ended up with these enormous changes that happened for women. And I realized, and in writing, it became very clear to me that for a woman lawyer in a law office seeking equality and equal pay with her male counterpart, that's in the law. But what about the woman who just arrived in Canada 10 years ago, who's cooking at a senior's residence, a private residence, making minimum wage or less than minimum wage, no job security, no benefits, no pensions, right? Who is she comparing herself to? And realizing that this movement, as all of our movements had to do, really had to change profoundly. And I think it has. I mean, in my years of working, and I quote a very important poll that found that Canadians are, in fact, we know that there's rising violence and discrimination in terms of racism, in terms of incidents in Canada. We know this is all very well documented, but that it has not entered the general public in the same way. That if people think that those racist behaviors are getting more Canadians to think like them, it's gone the opposite way. And I think it's really important for us to understand that I believe that for settlers, non-Indigenous people have never been more committed to reconciliation. I believe that we are in our movements deeply trying to right the wrongs of the past. And it's not easy. And I think one of the lessons that we have to learn is that you're not just going to make it go like this. It's not going to just be better. It's a journey. It's a process. Progress is a process. And we need to be committed to it and understand that it will be and remains hard, but work that absolutely has to be done.
Shifting gears here, in the 1980s, your activism took a shift, moving into challenging corporate rule. And in the book, you lay out in a very clear and succinct manner what you view as the three building blocks behind globalization. And I'd love it if you'd share with everybody sitting in tonight just these opening comments of yours as we move into what we know today as the free trade era.
Well, as you know, Paul, during the not even the late 1980s, through the 80s and the 90s, and even into this century, the dominant theory, economic theory, bought by most governments, the UN, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, was economic globalization. And that basically meant the smallest governments possible, allow the private sector, the financial sector, the big transnational corporations to make decisions about finance and trade, and governments will have a very specific but diminished role. And that was just commonly accepted, even by people who hadn't agreed with that before, just kind of, Tony Blair's third way. And the principle, as you say, the principle stools of it were privatization of public services. So you and I have fought privatization of healthcare, privatization of water services, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund saying to countries in the global south, you're going to, if you want funding for these projects, you have to go with a public-private partnership. And in some cases, we'll choose the corporation and so on. And the balance became so unbalanced, Paul, as you know, that of the 100 largest economies in the world now, 69 are corporations and only 31 are countries. And that's really stunning. And of course, when they speak, they have enormous power. The second, of course, was a deregulation of safety, of health, of protection for workers, protection of the environment, rules around resource extraction and so on, what they call cutting red tape. And that became the big cutting red tape. And then you'd cut red tape across boundaries because corporations didn't want to bump into higher standards in that boundary, at that country, than they have here. And of course, the move was to go to the lowest common denominator. And the best tool for that was these free trade agreements. Free trade is not about lowering tariffs and the barriers that existed before. Most of those are gone. Free trade, modern free trade, starting with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States and Mulroney was Prime Minister of Canada, really was about establishing what governments could no longer do. And that was absolutely clear that these are the rules. what is covered, the goods and services that are covered by these trade rules are not to be interfered with. They are to go over to the corporate sector for decision-making to take place. And one of the huge changes that COVID has made, I believe, is that COVID has absolutely shone the spotlight. We knew there were terrible problems with it before. Before COVID, the UN was saying that 3/4 of the world's working age population are in the precariat. No security in their jobs, no decent wages, no benefits, no pensions, and so on. 3/4. This is the brave new world we were promised. They said this movement will lift all boats, the big ships and the little boats all together. Well, that's just a bunch of nonsense. We knew that, but then COVID came along and it made it so clear, Paul, in terms of vaccine inequality, which we've all been fighting to get the WTO to relax the rules around the generics getting a hold of it. Water. Turns out that half the population of the world doesn't have a place to wash their hands with soap and warm water. And that was the first thing during COVID that we were told we had to do, shone the spotlight. And if anything good has come out of this, it is that aid money from the northern countries and aid agencies going to COVID relief in the global south has a lot of it's been going to install permanent sanitation services, understanding, by the way, that that's very much a women's issue in the global south and in some parts of the global north too. It's been debunked. And one of the beauties of my book was being able to go and quote economists who said, Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, who said, what I've been writing about, me and mainstream economists for the last 30 years, was at best wrong, at worst dangerous. We were wrong. This is the language he's using. The International Monetary Fund, which was promoting economic globalization and all of these practices, is now saying the private sector failed us during COVID. Failed us. The supply chains, not just the supply chains, the healthcare, the food security, it just didn't work. And they're saying governments have to come back into the picture. Governments have come back into the picture. There's been enormous government spending to protect their people in many, many countries, and from the global north to the global south. So it's been an opportunity. And I quoted earlier Rebecca Solnit saying that every major upheaval sets the stage for deep social change. And that's where we are now. The worry, of course, is that's a contested area, and we're going to have to duke that out in some ways. But yeah, I do think we can honestly say that stranglehold on our leaders and on except for some corporate leaders, on our thought leaders and academia is gone. Economic globalization in that form is gone. We don't want to go back to narrow nationalism. We want, travel and language and information sharing and all of that. All of that must be international. But we have to find ways of. We're in a fight for democracy. We're in a really deep fight for democracy in our world right now, and COVID shone the spotlight on just how fragile it is.
On the same vein, challenging corporate power, in the book, you share traveling around the globe and the many campaigns, and you're frank, there's been wins and there's been losses, and on occasion, tragedy. And in the book, you relay the events of the World Trade Organization ministerial meeting held in Cancun, Mexico in 2003, and the leader of the Farmers Union of South Korea. And for everybody watching in tonight, who was Lee Young-hae, and what was his story that you saw played out in Mexico?
Well, we got to Cancun, and what the police and the security authorities did was that they blocked off the major highway into Cancun. Now, only rich people live and tourists live in Cancun. All the people who work there live outside in small little villages and shanties and so on, and they need that highway to get to work. So it was blocked. So right away you have a problem. Great big high barricades, police with all of the, the uniforms and the face stuff and so on, heavy with the dogs. Like, it was really a confrontational place. Lee Kyung-hae was the president of the South Korean Farmers Union. And he had been opposed to the World Trade Organization and its agricultural policies, which basically is just run rampant over many, many farmers and farms and farm communities in the global South before and since. And he had been warning people that, you know, the WTO kills farmers. And he was there. His people were incredibly disciplined. We were having a protest at the barrier, and Lee Kyung-hae, nobody knew he was going to do this. And I don't believe any of his people knew either. He climbed the barrier. He had a sign saying WTO kills farmers, took the sign aside, took a knife, put it in his heart, swayed back and forth. We were all right there. We were all right there. Swayed back and forth and fell off and died in hospital a couple of hours later. And he left a note in his hotel room saying that he had to find a way to say that this is a life and death issue. This isn't some kind of esoteric thing on paper. This is about people's lives. It was absolutely riveting. And what was so moving was that this site of confrontation with the police became a shrine. And many of the delegates over at the WTO, not the Canadian delegation, I'm still angry about that, but many of the other delegations came and just were there just to, we had rice and the corn and beautiful little, candles and people left poems. And it was just a site where it was stopped being a protest site and entirely became a shrine. And on the last day, and by the way, that was a total and complete failure. On the last day, the African delegate stood up and said, "What part of no don't you understand? You're not getting it. You're running roughshod over us. We're finished." And they walked out, and a bunch of us sang a song we'd had prepared, which was the "Money Can't Buy Me Love" from the Beatles, or "Money Can't Buy the World." Now, buy the world. We were on the front page of many a newspaper around the world singing "Money Can't Buy Money Can't Buy the World." But on the last day, we had an agreement with the police. And there were many thousands of us from all over, of course, from Mexico, but from all over the place, many farmers, the Via Campesina and many. And we had an agreement with the police that at a certain point, there would be a sound sounded and we would sit. And everybody sat. Black bloc, everybody sat. And then led by Indigenous women, local Indigenous women, the Farmers Union came up and started to dismantle the barrier. And the police were on the other side, absolutely allowing it to happen, in some cases helping it to happen. And when the barrier came down, people came together in peace with the police. It was an amazing, now we had won, like we had made our point, but his sacrifice touched a chord in us that, you can see it's still very tender in my heart.
Thank you for that, Maude. And for all of you watching in tonight, I've read this book twice, once in an early draft and the final draft. And when you come to this part of the book and the story of the farmers of South Korea, you actually have to stop reading when you read this part of what Maude has written. And I urge you all to share this book widely with young people whom you love in your own families, because they will benefit from this. John just put up a note that if you go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your computer and type out a question, he's sorting those out. And I'm going to wrap up my conversation with Maude with a few more subjects we're going to tackle, and then we're going to go to your questions. So, Maude, moving into the 1990s, you assumed a global role in the fight to retain water as a public good, not a private commodity. And the book deals extensively with your role in the United Nations Declaration of Water as a Human Right. And share with us what those moments were like. In my view, kind of a crowning moment in your lifetime of activism, but share with us the UN Declaration.
Well, thank you, Paul. That actually was a real highlight in my personal life. We really wanted to have water and sanitation recognized as fundamental human rights, because when you have the lens of human rights, particularly if a country either includes this in their constitution or brings in a new law, it gives you an added layer of protection for whatever that right is. And so this became a rallying cry for our movement around the world. Water wasn't included in the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights because it wasn't an issue then, but it became very clear by the early part of the century that it was a major, major human rights issue with terrible deaths of particularly children. So I one day get a call from Father Miguel Descado Brockman, a Nicaraguan priest, liberation theologian priest, wonderful man. He was about to take over the presidency of the General Assembly it's only a year and it changes each year, but they get to set the political agenda. And he said, I want to make water and sanitation a human right. Are you with me? And I said, yeah, what am I doing today? I guess I can do that. And it was voluntary. I didn't get paid for it, but it was just an absolutely incredible, actually a year and a half, because I started working with him well before. And we paired up with Pablo Solon, who was then the ambassador from Bolivia to the United Nations. And we put together a team at the UN and we just put it forward, and everybody said, it's too early, we're not ready. Like, what are you not ready? When, what are you talking about? You're not ready to declare something that's killing children a child every 5 seconds. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So Pablo put it to the UN General Assembly, July 28th, 2010. I was in the balcony with some of my former staff, and they were in tears because we were sure we were going to lose. When they vote at the UN, they sit at their table and it comes up on a big electronic board. So right away, I was sure we were going to lose. Stephen Harper was prime minister and he was absolutely opposed to the human right to water. I'm convinced because he didn't want to deal with the issue on First Nations and lack of water and sanitation. I'm convinced that's why. But the US was opposed, Great Britain was opposed, the World Bank was opposed, the big water companies were opposed. We thought we were going to lose. 141 countries vote in favor, none vote against. 42 abstain, including Canada. So we got it. And by the way, since then, every country has adopted it in various forms. And since then, we have something like 4 dozen countries that have either amended their constitution or brought in separate legislation to recognize the human right to water. And there are a number of really exciting court cases that have used the resolution. Most importantly, Paul, it turned the lens on this issue from one of, it's a charity, it's a need. Poor people without water will find some charity. Maybe there'll be some World Bank money for some, to help with something, to an issue of justice. This is an issue of justice, not charity. This is your fundamental right to have clean, safe drinking water and sanitation. And for girls and women, it's absolutely essential because girls aren't going to go to school if there's no place for them, there's no private place for them to as a bathroom. It's just, they're not, and they have to go walk with their mothers for kilometers to get water. So it was a lovely moment, I have to say. And I'll just end by saying Pablo came up to the balcony with a group of us up there when just after the vote, and people were furious, the German and the different ambassadors, no, maybe not the German, it was the American and Canadian and French, I think, were going like this to him up in the balcony saying, we weren't ready and you pushed us and, blah, blah, blah. And he was standing there like this with this big shit-eating grin on his face as if to say, what part of I just won and you didn't do you not get? It was like a very sweet moment in my life. Yeah.
Wonderful. Last question for me, and then there are questions in the box, the Q&A box, and we're going to go to those. But the book ends, Maude, with you sharing how you remain hopeful moving forward. What gives Maude Barlow hope today?
Well, you asked me as well, and I'll put these two questions together. What is hope? What is my definition of hope? To my mind, hope is a commitment to protect all that is good for future generations and the planet, knowing that you cannot control the outcome, but anyway, still doing whatever you can, reaching out your hand to touch the web of the universe where you are, and having faith that others are doing the same. And it's incredibly important, Paul, that we understand this. I talk in the book about the need to have plans and to have goals and to have media outreach and communication strategy, and all that's true. But you can't control that. You have to say, I'm dedicated to the work that I'm doing, but I have to remain in a way detached from the outcome, because I'll make myself sick if I think, and I'm taking on too much on myself if I think I can control everything. Really, I can't. And you don't know where progress is going to come from. Again, I go back to Rebecca Solnit, who says that progress isn't an army marching forward. It's a crab scuttling sideways. It's decades or centuries of water dripping on a stone and changing its shape. And that's the story of the women's movement, is you can make change, and it can come upon society like a change in weather. But in fact, a lot of people have been doing a lot of work. So I'm very hopeful about many things. And the entire last chapter of the book, as you know, is about the things to be hopeful for. And the one, we don't have time to go into them all. The understanding that economic globalization has failed, I think, is deep and real. And I have a lot of really good examples. I have a lovely quote from this woman, just an economist in Washington. And she says, the WTO is like that guy at the bar, standing over by himself. He's dressed in a nice suit, but it's old and kind of hasn't been ironed in a while. And he's looking around thinking, why isn't anybody talking to me? I used to be a big shot, right? I just think it's a beautiful image to describe, this very powerful institution that just hasn't been able to go where it wanted to go because we said no. But I think the thing that makes me most hopeful is what I call the age of nature, and the understanding that the protection and restoration of biodiversity is absolutely key. We are fighting the climate crisis, as you know, but we need to see it as more than just greenhouse gas emissions and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. We have to look at the health and well-being of soil, wetlands, forests, and watersheds. And there's what I call in the book a tsunami of not only interest, but information, studies, research, commitments, treaties towards understanding that we are not dominion over animals and dominion over the earth. We are, in fact, part of nature, and that in learning from Indigenous teachings, understanding the need for what I call the age of nature is absolutely critical. And so it really feels to me like a journey that starts with women's equality and justice and moves into challenging economic globalization, and then the water and climate part of it, because I feel that those of us who have had this journey have brought what we learned from the past and brought it to the work of the current times. But that gives me hope. Now, has a lot of that been stopped by the war? You bet. And we all have to try to figure out this. But there is, I just feel there's a change, and I see it in young people. There's an understanding. They get it about plastics. They get it. They get it about plastic bottled water. They get it about their talking to their parents about climate. They get it. They're learning it at school. We need to spend a lot of time on that part of the equation and the hope that goes with it.
Okay, let's go to our viewers. John has posted for me the first question from Deb here in Winnipeg, and I'll give you her question. Even in Canada, in our First Nations communities struggle with access to safe water. What more should we be looking to do? Wow, that's quite a question.
Well, it's a great question, and thank you very much, Deb. It's been something Paul and I, from our former organizations, have spent a lot of time around, the issues of lack of sanitation and clean drinking water. I have to say there's been huge improvement, and I really think we need to recognize when we ask governments to do something and they actually do it, we shouldn't always say that they're not doing it. This government has put more commitment, energy, and money into this issue than all former liberal, conservative federal governments put together. There have been 128 long-term boil water advisories ended. There still are something like, I think, 31 to go, but there's a timetable for that. There has been a commitment, and I do believe with all my heart, and I think the polls show this is true, that Canadians want this done. there's a deep understanding when you get kids, the school kids from all over the country, writing the Prime Minister, dear Prime Minister Trudeau, do something about it. You know that we have that. That's really important. So yes, I hear you, and it's important, but I keep up the pressure on the government. But the more important issue around First Nations, Indigenous people, and water is the invasive extraction industries, and that doesn't get the same kind of attention. So you get fracking in northern British Columbia and through Alberta. You get the exploration, the oil and gas exploration. You get in communities where there are small populations and people think, oh, you're not going to be able to fight back. This is where it's happening. This is where really invasive extractive industry is happening. And it's not just in Canada, it's around the world. We call it environmental racism for a reason. These are communities, either Indigenous or communities of color, or poor communities, or poor peasant communities in the global South, who, I mean, aren't going to do it in downtown, Winnipeg or downtown Ottawa. So to my mind, I would like for us to ask that further question, because I think there's a lot of work to be done with First Nations communities around the issue of destruction of their waterways for industrialization and for these extractive industries.
Well, that's a perfect segue into Matthew's question, which builds on the first question we had. Matthew asks, can you comment on the irony of First Nations in northern Manitoba living under boil water advisories while sacrificing their once pristine rivers and lakes for renewable hydroelectric energy projects? Is this environmental racism?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, and we look at, the mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. I mean, we have these examples right across the country. One of the things that I think we need to be talking more about is electricity and electric cars. I don't think the environmental movement and the climate movement is talking enough about the potential damage to our waterways and our major rivers of moving quickly to a system that's going to depend on hydro. I just don't think we've talked about it enough, and we can't avoid these difficult discussions. We simply can't avoid it. And so yes, and of course it happens in remote communities, in communities where there are, First Nations, small communities, small rural communities, and it's harder for people to fight back. But because this is all about hope, and the book's about hope, I also write about a wonderful new project in northern Quebec. A river is called the Magpie River, and the First Nation there has worked with the community and the municipalities and the provincial government to have the river, the Magpie River, declared legal personage. And it's not a person, but that it has legal rights not to be destroyed, not to be overfished, not to be polluted, and that the First Nations are the key. That First Nations community are the keepers of the Magpie River, and it's a very clear agreement that they have, very clearly spelled out what the rights and responsibilities are, because we have to start thinking about a new way of protecting nature. Because right now, most Western law, including in Canada, is really about how much have you been hurt by an environmental spill or whatever? Can you prove that your property or your business is damaged? Well, that's not protection of nature. So people say, oh, well, you're saying you could never fish. No, but you wouldn't be allowed to fish a species to extinction, right? So how can we start putting our heads around this? And there's some very exciting work being done, again, led by Indigenous communities. And there's a group of people communities along the St. Lawrence that would like the St. Lawrence River to be declared to have legal protective status. So when you're not thinking, it's not coming from the top, and we're not getting the protections that we need. And Canadians have taken our water for granted. I call it the myth of abundance. We have so much. We can do whatever we want. We can dump whatever we want into it. We can extract as much as we want. We can move it from here, there to here, because it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, and we're learning that.
Mhm.
Here's this counter movement, and I think you're going to see it taking off, and I think you're going to see it led by First Nations people.
Okay, I've got 3 questions in the box, and I think we can get to all of them. We'll kind of call this a short snapper round because I really want to get to all of these. They're very good questions.
If you want to do them all, Paul, I'll answer them.
Roni Daliwal asks, could you please speak to the crisis being caused by microplastics? How would we work to get rid of them from our environment?
Well, thank you again. Just an incredible, incredible issue. And we know now that plastics, microplastics are in our lungs, it's in our blood, it's in the food that we're eating. It is a scourge. And it absolutely, and one of the, again, the worries that right now with the crisis in the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that we're putting some of this on the back burner, and it mustn't be put on the back burner. We absolutely have to have laws, and we need to do this very quickly. But a good news, because I'm about good news and hope, is that there is a move to an international treaty, a very serious movement towards a treaty that many countries have agreed to, including Canada, to start to move to a very serious treaty to start to begin with to protecting the oceans, because so much of this stuff is getting into the oceans, but of course it's getting into all of our waterways. But again, plastics, Paul and I started this Blue Communities project, and one of the agreements that a municipality makes is to phase out it's bottled water. We're now starting a project on blue schools, so that schools will not sell or they're not going to tell the kid you can't bring it to school if that's what your parent put in the lunchbox, but you're going to teach the kids and you're not going to provide it for them. We have to have an understanding. Every single minute in the world, 1 million bottles of plastic water are sold. If you put them all end to end, just the little single-use plastic bottles, they would reach halfway to the sun and back. It absolutely has to stop.
That answer really touches on the next question from Chantali Villalona. She asks, what strategies would you recommend for overcoming tap water distrust that keeps citizens from using their tap water and instead relying on plastic water bottles? So you kind of touched on it, but how do we build trust in public water?
Well, Paul, you should answer this. You and I did a whole tour on this and we talked about it. We have good water coming out of our taps, not in all First Nations. I'm understanding, but in your municipalities, in fact, since 2012, there's been a very strict agreement between the provinces and the federal government to really ramp up the protections around wastewater, human wastewater, and our municipal wastewater systems. And money is being spent in our municipalities across the country. With rare exceptions, you can trust the water coming out of your tap. Maybe it doesn't have a taste that you like. You might want to get a filter or one of those Brita, whatever they are, or a filter on your sink. But really, and I know for people who've lived in other countries where the water wasn't safe, sometimes they didn't learn not to trust it there for good reason. They come here maybe and think they the same thing, maybe the same problem, but really we put a lot of energy and time into keeping our water clean. What we need to do, and this is something that Eco Justice and others are working at with the new Canadian Environmental Law Act, Environmental Protection Act, which is just coming out. The revisions are coming out now, is to deal with the microplastics, to deal with the chemicals, because we do allow too many chemicals into our food production. But this is a process that we are working towards.
Okay, there's many more questions. I'm going to squeeze one more in, and then we're going to have to turn it back to John shortly after Maude says a few closing remarks. But the last question from Shirley, it's really a broad and a really excellent question. How do we also educate Canadians about the export of water and the destruction of the environment when folks want perfect flowers and especially roses? How can we educate more about being good stewards of the water system, I guess?
Well, thank you, Shirley. And I mean, this again, a question dear to my heart, because I write a lot, not so much in this book, but in other books about what's called virtual water. And that's the water that's used to produce anything, come from computers to commodities like rice, cattle, roses. And then if that commodity is shipped away, then you've shipped away the water. And Canada is a major virtual water export. We export more water virtually than we bring in. And many wealthy countries are doing just the opposite. They're bringing in more. Because we have this myth of abundance that we can just do whatever we want. We produce grain and so on for others using up our water. And we really need to have protections absolutely built in. Education, I would like to see separate education around water in all our schools. Mostly it gets wrapped into climate, and all the problems with water, drought and pollution and so on is climate change. Well, it's not. Climate change, of course, adds to the water issue, but the way we abuse water and over extract it is one of the major causes of the climate crisis. And I'm really would love to have a whole other life now, Paul. I'm going to start again. I'm going to come back and be the ghost that haunts everybody. We need absolutely in all of our schools, we need basic fundamental water education and water justice education, not just water protection, but water justice. But thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Maude, and my apologies to all the questions we're not going to get to tonight, but we're under a kind of a time constraint here. And I simply want to say to you, Maude, thank you again for this wonderful, deeply personal, if I can say, very needed book. I think we always need hope, but coming out of a pandemic and with the world, the peace around our planet very much in question nowadays, my goodness, we do need hope. We don't need to dwell in what's impossible. Your book talks about what's possible, and a lifetime of commitment to progressive causes. Still hopeful is, in my view, a crowning achievement for you. Although I can't wait for the next book. Let me turn it to you for some closing remarks, and then I'll give it back to John.
Thank you very much, Paul, again, for your support and love. I'm going to just end with two quotes, one that I start the book with and one that I end. The very first is from Banksy, the wonderful British street artist, who says, "When you are tired, learn to rest, not to quit." And the other, at the very end of the book, I quote a wonderful poet. His name is E. Ethelbert Miller. He's a much-loved African-American poet, and he's chair of the board of the Institute for Policy Studies. He's the poet laureate of Washington, D.C. And he has these beautiful words that I want to share with you, and we're just perfectly rounding out the time here. He says, "Place your heart in your hands and blow gently. Spread love like seed." Thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight.
Maude, on behalf of everybody in our virtual universe here tonight, thank you, and a big thank you to the folks at McNally. I urge you all to pick up this book, and let me turn it now back to John Taves, who will tell you how you can do that. John.
Thank you so very much, Paul. I will keep the gratitude going as well, just by thanking the CCPA Manitoba Office for all their help in promoting the event, Hannah for speaking on behalf of the office, everybody at the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, McNally Robinson Saskatoon, and ECW Press. Again, copies of Still Hopeful, Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism are available at McNally Robinson Booksellers, either by phone, in person, or online. Wherever you are in Canada, we will find a way to get this book into your hands. It is such a wonderful read, and I would highly recommend it. I can't come up with more perfect closing comments than those that Maude gifted us with. So thank you so very much, Maude, for your time and for all your energy over all the years, and for taking the time once again to come and join us. Thank you again to Paul for hosting the event with such aplomb, and to all of you for joining us here tonight, both live here in the Zoom webinar and on YouTube here and in the future. This video will remain live, so if you'd like to revisit it or share it with somebody who wasn't able to attend, please do so. Otherwise, here's hoping you all have